Hi everyone, Tony Tonkin here from the Child Protection Party with another exciting and riveting feed for you all. Avery and I have been farting around with the system, trying to get it to be a little bit more efficient and better, and in doing so I think I stuffed it up at the beginning. But we'll wait and see whether all the changes we put in place actually work. But today I want to talk about Indigenous issues, and particularly, of course, around children that are removed from their families and parents. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because I've come upon an article that was written in The Conversation about this that I thought we needed to at least have a discussion around, because the number of kids, as we all know, that are Indigenous and that are removed are far way out of proportion to what happens with other children in our society. And it is an issue which has been highlighted by us, by many other people, First Nations people in particular, over many, many years, for which there's never been a solution. No one has never really understood what it is that they could do to change the situation. But however, this article, I think, highlights some of the issues which are paramount in this particular area. And I just wanted to share it with you. The article's called First Nations Children Are Still Being Removed at Disproportionate Rates. Cultural Assumptions About Parenting Need to Change. And I think that in this article, the explanations as to why these children are being removed at such alarming rates is important. Also, there's some correlations between the reasons why kids get removed generally, regardless of your culture, is also highlighted by some of the things that are stated in this article. So in here we have I've highlighted some areas that I think we need to discuss. If you wish to make a comment about them, please do. If you're watching us on YouTube, we really would like you to subscribe and ring the bell, if you wouldn't mind. And so in this particular article, it says First Nations children are still being removed at disproportional rates. As a result, contemporary child protection systems and associated professions have sought to distance themselves from explicitly racist past policies and practices by apologising for their past involvement in the stolen generation and committing to change. Yet child protection systems continue to operate on assumptions about race and class that increase inequalities and injustices about First Nations families. Now, the issue for me here is that we as social workers and as a community have spent heaps of time apologising for the atrocities that we've caused in the past. Yet, however, it hasn't seemed to change the way we choose to practice. Our practices are appalling. Our practices are systemically racist within departments of child protection. Yet when it all comes to the fore, when we have an investigation or an inquiry or whatever around this, everybody puts up their hands and apologises for the stolen generation, for children that were removed at birth, for children that have been sexually abused while in the care of the state, and so it goes on. At every opportunity, everybody apologises, but nothing changes. This is the thing. 20 years down the track, there'll be a whole host of new inquiries in the child protection system around First Nations people, other kids and whatever, and it'll just indicate that nothing has ever changed, nothing ever seems to change. But this article highlights some issues that we at the Child Protection Party have been talking about for quite some time. So it goes on to say, yet child protection systems continue to operate on assumptions about race and class. Indigeneity was found to be a greater predictor of a subsequent child protection reports and investigations than a rating of high risk on child protection risk assessment tools. So the notion that someone simply was an Aboriginal child or came from an Aboriginal family was in itself becomes a risk factor. Now, to me, that has to be the most racist, xenophobic response that one can imagine, because we're automatically identifying a specific race as presenting with a set of risk factors, even though there may not be any other factors involved in the safety of that child. The fact that they come from an Indigenous family seems to me, for many social workers, for other that works in this field, that seems to be enough. And it goes on to say, white social constructions are often informing major decision-making in child protection practices and policies. This is because legislators and those making decisions about child protection are often white. So true. One of the major problems that I've had over the years has been that we have chosen not to have a group of well-trained Indigenous people working within the child protection system. At one point, I don't know whether it's changed here in South Australia, but at one point a few years back, there was one Indigenous worker working with 3 or 4 officers, of which there were hundreds of kids that had been removed. And I would turn up to a meeting where if you've got an Indigenous client, you're supposed to have one of these workers there to represent them and their culture. And very rarely would I find any of those workers. And I know from speaking to those workers, they were frustrated because they were extremely busy. And secondly, they weren't represented themselves in terms of their numbers to represent these kids and these families appropriately. So it's, if we're actually keen to change this system, if we want to change this system, we have to find ways to invest in the people who are affected by the system, not produce more white people to make judgments around black people, but to have more black people that can work with their community in order to resolve the issues that cause them to come under the scrutiny of the child protection system in the first place. Even though one of those reasons why they do become notified is because they're simply black or brown. It's disgraceful. However, goes on to say, however, families disproportionately affected by these decisions are often Indigenous. This means they are often ignored cultural differences on how children are raised. Again, this is another key issue that we don't understand. We think that because we live in this westernized society, that this is the culture that encapsulates everybody. And that's just not true. If you're Sudanese, you're going to treat your kids differently. You have a different sense of family and all that sort of stuff. If you're Indigenous, you're going to have a completely different set of circumstances around. And later on, this article describes what they are in greater detail. But the reality is that if we're Western and white, we see this is the right way that it should be done without considering for one moment the cultural differences that sit there and the way that culture may work with children that in many ways is probably better and more effective than our own. However, we have our filters on that prevent us from seeing other stuff that is as beneficial or more beneficial, I guess, to many of these children that we're removing than the stuff that we think is normal. Oops, wrong one. So, the recent documentary, the Department told the story of First Nation woman Stacey and struggles trying to get her children returned to her care. If anybody's seen that, I have some issues around that documentary, but, it was out there. The size of Stacey's house was viewed by Child Protection Services as a barrier. Now, Stacey complied with the department's guidelines, including moving into a larger house with 4 bedrooms, despite having 2 of her children in her care. The film ends with 3 of Stacey's children remaining in out-of-home care. So, in this instance, Stacey had done what the department had wanted of her, but it wasn't enough. Probably because she was black, so or because she was Indigenous or whatever. So, no matter what a person does, and then the assumption is that because there are so many people in that house, and because there are just so many rooms, then that means that there's obviously overcrowding, and then the children get removed accordingly, forgetting that the care of those children, even in overcrowded premises, is probably pretty good, because there's a whole lot of other family members that are caring and looking after those children as well. But we don't consider any of that. This ignorance of Indigenous ways of parenting could be contributed to the 2017 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children out of home care as of 30th of June 2019. So that number would be higher today. According to the Family Matters report, this represents 1 in every 16.6 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children living in Australia. First Nations children had far higher rates of substantiations for neglect compared to non-Indigenous children. So 31.8% was around neglect, and for non-Indigenous kids, it was 18.2. So almost double the amount of children removed because of neglect. Now, neglect is a very subjective view. So someone goes into a house and their version of parenting doesn't fit with what they see, then suddenly the children are neglected. I was at someone's place today, and one of the reasons why the children were removed, one of the many, but one of the reasons was because they looked in the fridge and there wasn't any food in the fridge. They didn't look in the cupboard, apparently, where there was heaps of food in the cupboard. But because someone made a judgment about how much food should be in a fridge, that was one of the reasons why the children were removed, because they were apparently neglected. So what we need to be mindful here is that if we're going to subjectively view a family or a group of people, we are going to be making decisions that disadvantage that group. If we're unable to see the cultural elements that govern the way they manage their lives, then that particular group of people is going to continually be disadvantaged. Currently, child protection services often punish and blame individuals for their dysfunction or risk. Genuine support with a focus on addressing the drivers of child protection involvement remain lacking. So genuine support which focuses on addressing the reasons why child protection are involved in the first place are lacking. And it goes on to say, so I've cut out, I'm just looking at the salient points within all of this. Increased involvement of child protection agencies with First Nation families contributes to a harmful perception among those who report issues to child protection. Teachers, health professionals, police and the general public. The First Nations families ought to be surveilled more than others. So where a lot of these... So the issue there is that where there's a lot of reporting around Indigenous kids and families come from teachers, health professionals, police, and the general public. And part of the issue here is that, actually, we'll talk about this in just a moment. I'll just come to this issue. What else have we got here? Okay, here we go. They do not need to supply substantive proof or evidence of the illegal harm. They need only to have reasonable belief of harm or potential harm. Their judgment as to what constitutes child abuse or neglect is at their discretion, as I said, subjective. The notifier can also remain anonymous to the family who are the target of the allegation. And I just wish to talk about this for a moment, primarily because it's important. And I haven't had a look to see... there are some comments happening here. That's good to see you. Number of people are viewing. Welcome. And I just want to remind you to subscribe and ring that little bell if you're watching on YouTube. So what I want to do is to talk about just that bit that I had up there for a moment, which was the idea of proof. So anybody... So the range of people they talked about that can register a complaint, police officers, whatever, and the general public, means that you can be concerned about a child, and that's fine, and that's the way it should be. But you when you make a notification, that notification is treated as if it is an actual risk factor that you, the public, whatever, lack experience, whatever. And it's funny, when I talk about lacking experience, I'm saying that a lot of these teachers, police professionals and social workers don't have the experience to do the assessment in the first place. So now we're asking the general public to make an assessment as to what's happening with regard to these kids. And anyway, so someone, Joe Bloggs, makes the assessment, makes the notification, and the kids wind up being removed based on those notifications. their judgment is as to what constitutes child abuse or neglect is lacking, because they're not professionals. They haven't got experience in this particular area. They don't know. But it is seen as and viewed as a realistic and a reasonable notification. The person who makes the notification isn't identified. Their history in terms of their relationship to whoever they're notifying about isn't recorded. They could be making spurious, offensive type notifications, and no one's going to query them. And of course, at the end of the day, you don't know who it is that's made that notification anyway. So there's no way you can seek some sort of retribution from that person for a false notification, even though that may have meant that your children have been removed and you've suffered psychologically, emotionally, not to mention the trauma and the same things that the children may have suffered from. So social workers have acknowledged the harms of past practices, this is what I was saying about before. However, they remain complicit in child protection systems that continue to inflict harm against First Nations families and communities. These practices have resonance with the stolen generation. There is a strong similarity between what's happening now in terms of the number of Indigenous kids being removed compared to even non-Indigenous kids. And it is like, to me, it's no different from, if anybody's seen Rabbit Proof Fence, and that moment where the authorities arrive in their black cars and they just grab the kids and toss them in their cars. I can't see any difference between those images and what happens today when the police turn up with a social worker and they come in and they just take those kids, and the parents don't know where in the hell they've gone from that moment on. Perhaps the system is a little bit better because it's legislated against in some ways that perhaps are some improvements, but the basic thing is the same. It's about taking kids and putting them into places where often people don't know that they are being placed. And Indigenous kids in particular should always be placed in Indigenous households, which they're often not. And with kinship carers in particular. So just finalising this bit, and then I'll go to your comments because I haven't had a chance to look at any of them yet. Better support for First Nation families to stay together is needed to avoid more generations of stolen children. And this is an article by Mr. Kitchell, and it was a fabulous article, and I thank the conversation for this particular article. It was sensational. So look, really interested to know what you think about all of this and what changes you think could be made to be able to improve the system. So there's a few people on board, which is fantastic. If you've got any comments, I'll just quickly go through some of these comments, see if I can go. Thanks, JJ. Yeah, it's sad that it's still happening. Also made too complicated by the system, says Kate, through restriction of resources and decisions. Oh, far out, Simon. Laura was beaten and needed brain surgery from being in care. God. There's another issue that keeps coming up for us, and that is, how do we ever hold these people responsible for the damage they do to kids? They can hold us responsible. They could charge us with neglect or whatever, and we could find ourselves before a court. And in many cases, of course, they go to the youth court and the kids get taken, and we don't have any say over what happens to those kids. I have countless people tell us about bruising on kids, kids complaining about the way they're being treated in residential care, and nothing ever seems to change. There's no repercussions for the system at all. So Simon's talking there. Sorry, Simon, to hear all that. The stats speak for themselves, do they? Well, I don't know what. So Robin says, why is not the UN? Well, the UN has no power to start with. The UN just sort of sets some guidelines and hopes that everybody else will sign up to them. And in this case, we've signed up to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Children, but it means bugger all. So could we have... and I like that bit too, Robin. It is a humanitarian crisis. one of the things I think that frustrates me the most is that, with all due respect to anti-vaxxers and people about freedom marches and shit, fine, but we've been having this problem for decades, for actually 100 years. This has been a problem, removing kids unnecessarily, in many cases, from their homes. And yet we don't have hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands, whatever it is, protesting about that down our streets. People object to a jab in the arm, apparently, and not being able to go and do what they would normally do on a daily basis, and having to have vaccination and stuff. But, I wish someone would just share my frustration over this, because we work really hard in order to, or the Child Protection Party does, and Avery and all of our executive, in order to make these issues more known. Yet, if we called a rally on Saturday in the city, we'd be lucky if we had 20 people turn up. That's the problem. People say they care, right? But when push comes to shove, they don't. Yet this is an issue that the whole community should be concerned about. So we'll get a whole lot of QAnon theorists talking about, the right, the left rather, and politicians raping and pillaging and raping kids and eating their blood and a whole lot of other stupid friggin' crap. And yet, we wouldn't, and they're obsessed by some of that QAnon shit, but do they really mean it? They don't, because if we had a rally, I can guarantee you, none of those people would turn up. Not one of them. Not one of them. Because unless it happens to you, people don't care. Unless, a child dies, or, the William Tyrrell case gets placed in front of the media all the time, people don't care. Right? But little do know people know that, doors down from them, next door neighbour maybe, a kid potentially is being harmed, whether that be psychological or emotional abuse, whether that be through domestic violence or whatever, or in some cases, regretfully, even sexual abuse. So, but at the end of the day, most people don't seem to care. 4,000 children out of home care, over 32,000 have been. There was a statistic here which I might just have another look at, which I'm wondering whether... investigation notification. So, yeah, this was interesting. I didn't show this earlier. So children receiving protective services, 1920. So subject to an investigation of notification, 117,000 kids. 107. I don't know what receiving child protection services mean, because they offer bugger all in terms of services. So is that a notification? Don't know what that means. So that is like someone's notified, and the department might have sent someone a letter, maybe just rang them up, had a chat to the parent, whatever. But subject to investigate, 117,000. So there's 117,000. So let's assume even if there was 3 or 4 people on average in a family, that's nearly 500,000 people that are impacted by this system. Now, not all those kids get removed, right? Because of all of those kids that are notifications. And sometimes the notifications are made, but an investigation doesn't take place, simply because they just don't have the staff to be able to do so. Maybe to some extent we should be grateful for that. But in terms of applying for services, I don't know what sort of services they're expecting to get from the child protection system, because they get bugger all in terms of appropriate services. Right, so... Right. So look, if you've got any further comments, please make them on our Facebook page or our YouTube page. And if you could you please subscribe to our YouTube channel. So thanks for being with us. Take care. Look after yourselves, everybody. And above all, make sure that you and your children are safe.